Hey, folks, Reverend Brian Johnson here, and I'm super excited that I get the opportunity to do another one of our interviews with either pastors or missionaries. And today I get an opportunity to do one with one of our newer pastors who has taken over for the legend, Reverend Dr. Perkins at Greater Christ Church. And so our prayer is that their new pastor, who's going to be with us here, Reverend Dr. Micah Gaines, he too, in his own way, will become a next legend among our churches in Greater Christ, not so much for Greater Christ or even for himself, but for the kingdom of God, that it would be manifest in and throughout Detroit and the world. So, Dr. Gaines, we are super excited to have you here with us. Before we get into ministry stuff, tell us a little bit about you, your background, and your family that helps make you who you are today and what you value.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be in this space, even virtually. It's a joy. I know you know a lot of preachers who could be here, but instead you allowed me to be here. So I'm glad to be here. My name is Micah Gaines. I'm originally from Lexington, Kentucky. I am the only son of Pastor Richard and Sarah Gaines. Grew up there in Lexington, matriculated through the University of Kentucky with a bachelor's degree. Did my seminary training at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union for a Master of Divinity. Just finished doctoral work at United Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. My work was entitled "The Church Has Left the Building, a Model for Virtual Ministry in the 21st Century." I am a proud Pointer Brown Goodman Scholar. I am a church kid at heart. I grew up in the church. Anything that could be done in the church, I did at least some point in time. I was an usher. I was a choir member. I was a musician. I played drums, keyboard, organ. If there was an opportunity, I did at some point in my life. I really did. Starting to call to ministry around the high school age. Of course, ran from it. Had no desire to preach. Went to undergrad. Actually, for sport management, I wanted to be the GM of the Lakers. That was my dream job. But the Lord came calling, and I said yes. And I just celebrated 10 years of ministry not too long ago. So I'm glad to be here. Ended up in Detroit by God's providence. I get to serve in a phenomenal church that's been served by phenomenal leadership. Reverend Dr. James Perkins is one of God's best leaders on the planet. I'm so glad to be able to be in this sacred space. My wife's name is Adrian. We have a 1-year-old son, Micah Richard Gaines II. And we're just glad to be in Detroit. So it's been a fun ride. So we're just glad to see what God is doing, what God will continue to do in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead.
So, Dr. Gaines, you touched on it briefly, but I wonder if you would kind of unpack a little bit, because a lot of people who've never had to go through that process of discerning a call to ministry, they just wonder if one day we wake up and all of a sudden God, has a harp playing and angelic choir, and we feel a call to ministry, and then we go into ministry full speed ahead. We don't ever sin again. We don't ever look back, and off we go. Take the listeners through a little bit more of what really went into this call, how that journey has led you, and not just in receiving that call to ministry, but also take us through that call and how that call actually gets you to where you are right now at Greater Christ.
Sure. So my initial call to ministry, I said I was probably 16, 17 years old. I was a church kid. My father's a pastor, so by default, people assume all through my childhood he's gonna preach like his dad. He's gonna preach. I wanted no parts. I think the reality of when you're around ministry, you see the weight of ministry. I think you.
Mm.
I think most people who were called to ministry didn't go the first time. There are a few that I know. My father-in-law is one of them. He ran toward it full speed ahead immediately.
Mm.
That was not my story. I wanted no parts. I saw what ministers dealt with. I saw what preaching entailed. I saw the weight that it put on people's lives, their families. I wanted no part whatsoever. But I was like Gideon. The more God kept giving signs, I needed more signs. I was stubborn. And I remember the last one I really asked for. I was the president of our district youth department at the time. And every year you had to give an annual address. And I was wrestling with my call to ministry at the time. And I remember asking the Lord the night before I was supposed to speak, I said, Lord, if this is not of you, let me fall flat on my face tomorrow. And I will never do this again. I will go back to the drums. I'll go back to whatever I was doing. But if this is of you, let me fall flat on my face tomorrow and I'll never do it again.
Mm,
Long story short, that's not what happened. God kept confirming, but I still wasn't sold. So I went to school, freshman at UK, and I was going to sport management. I had lined up internships and things because I went to UK, which is the mecca of college basketball. Anything, I know I'm in Michigan, but University of Kentucky, go Cats. Anything, basketball wise on a college spectrum, UK is the place to do it. And I had lined up, employment, internships, things of that nature. And they all started falling through, literally one by one. I couldn't get into classes I needed. The
mm,
intern I had lined up fell through. It was literally like God was saying, if you don't walk through the door I'm trying to open for you, I'm going to slam all the others. And literally, I had no choice but to surrender to God because He was saying, this is what I've called you to. So when I finally
yeah.
said yes, it was like my whole life kind of fell into place naturally. Ended up in seminary after undergrad, and one by one, God just had more confirmatory signs that I'm right where He had me to be, and it's been a
Mm.
joy. It's been a struggle, but it's been a joy. I've enjoyed it.
So, prior to your receiving the call to come to Greater Christ, share with us where your ministry was um, before coming to Greater Christ and how you were able to discern that, yes, in this season, God is calling me to Greater Christ.
Sure, great question. So I was a staff pastor for my father at the Consolidated Baptist Church in Lexington, Kentucky. Most recently, I was the pastor of worship. So that meant anything that occurred in the sanctuary came through my desk. So music, media, dance, drama, ushers, greeters, parking lot, worship planning. If it occurred in the sanctuary, it was my responsibility. In addition to preaching, teaching, congregational care. So, I'm doing that daily basis. Of course, with the pandemic, I'm taking on production work for our online campus,
Mm,
and scripting and things of that nature. So I was doing just about everything that I could possibly do, along with the other duties as assigned. You know how that goes in the Baptist church, other duties as assigned. So I'm pretty busy. I'm doing that. Still have a pretty extensive preaching schedule in other places that God gives opportunity throughout the country. A lot is happening simultaneously, so I don't have the luxury of balancing one thing at a time. I'm wearing a lot of different hats. Of course, in that time, I've gone to school as well. So I finished 3 degrees since I started preaching: a Bachelor of Science in Community Leadership Development, a Master of Divinity, and a Doctor of Ministry. So I'm getting my education because I believe that a call to preach is a call to prepare. So I took that very seriously. So I'm doing all those things, make sure my father has the support he needs pastorally, and still trying to discern what God has for me as well. So in this phase, I'm in different processes with different churches, to see, if those are going to work. Those can be interesting depending on how
mhm.
search committees work and all those logistics and details and nuances. And I remember when Greater Christ first arose, they didn't do a traditional national search. They did recommendations. So, somehow my name ended up in the stack for Greater Christ, and I went through the process. And I remember I was discerning what God was doing because I thought I was going somewhere else, honestly.
Mm, mm,
And God ended up closing that door. And I remember saying to God, God, whatever you're doing, make it so obvious that I can't miss it. And the more I began to have conversations with Greater Christ and be in prayer, it became abundantly clear that this was a God setup. This was a divinely orchestrated, merger between pastor and people. And as God began to reveal that and make that clear, He really let me know definitively that, where what I have for you is for you. So don't get ahead of me. Don't, lag behind me, but trust my timing, trust my purpose, trust my process. And wherever you end up, it's going to be where I have you. And when Greater Christ finally completed, like, I know for a fact I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And it's been a
mm.
blessing to see overall. I've really enjoyed it.
Excellent. So, um, what would you say to folks within our region? Some are pastors, many are not. What how would you articulate or name what are some of the challenges of ministry in this season of the world that we are living in?
Sure, that's a weighty question, but I'll knock a few if I can. The first one, balance is a myth.
Mm,
People ask me all the time, how do you stay balanced? I don't. I don't. Balance is a myth. The way it was explained to me by one of my uncles in ministry, the Reverend Dr. F. Bruce Williams, he said, nephew, he said, if you do this long enough, the more you juggle multiple balls, eventually one of them is going to fall. That's part of the nature. The key is to make sure the same one doesn't fall too many times in a row.
mm,
And that's what I live by. At the end of the day, I balance a lot. I have a lot going on. And one of the challenges for me is to try to get everything done in the same pacing. And that's just not the nature. Various seasons of life come with different challenges, different transitions. And the reality is faithfulness looks different in every season. Your job is to be faithful, be
yeah.
found be found faithful. The goal is not to be successful. The goal is to be faithful. Like nowhere in scripture does Jesus say, well done, good and successful servant. He says,
Yeah.
well done, good and faithful servant. I think as the world is changing, we're having to reimagine what does church look like? How do we navigate post-pandemic culture? How do we become creative? How do we sustain creativity? It's so many things that are pulling and tugging at us to stay relevant. And I just believe that, the word of God is still relevant. I don't have to make the Bible what it already is. I don't have to make church what she already is. I think if I can just be found faithful, then God will handle the rest. Dr. Charlie
Yeah.
Dates told me, he said, if you take care of the depth of your ministry, God will handle the width. And
Mm,
that has kept me sane on so many occasions because I realize that when the weight of it gets to be too heavy for me, my job is not to manage my width. My job is to maintain my depth.
yeah. So you come into Greater Christ, and correct me if I'm wrong. You arrive on scene, and you're still in your 20s, and you succeed a giant who, though he may look like he's still in his 20s, he's not still in his 20s. We'll just leave it at that. So what are some strategic shifts that either you have made or are in process of making there at Greater Christ, not to fix anything, but to help usher Greater Christ from where she is into this new season of ministry that we're experiencing every single day?
Sure. So first thing, Dr. Perkins did a phenomenal job of getting the church ready for transition.
Mm,
That cannot be understated because every church that goes through transition is not prepared for transition.
yeah.
So he did an incredible job of getting them ready for what was coming next. I owe him majorly just for that alone. So for me, a few things that we've kind of been doing this year, particularly to increase our digital footprint, because in this post-pandemic culture, our reach spans outside of our walls. So we
Yeah.
can no longer just assume the field of dreams model. If you build it, they will come. But nowadays, we have literally the entire world at our fingertips. So two things we've done this year. We got a new website, we got new sound, new cameras, really broadened our social media footprint to make sure that the experience in person is just as good online. So if you follow us online, our new handle is at Greater Christ Detroit. So you get sermon recaps, you get reels, you get information about what we're doing. We have a new mobile app, just different things to make sure that our reach spans beyond Iroquois and Mac. That's been a key piece for us
Yeah.
because the reality is in a post-pandemic era, people have options. Your competition, quote unquote, is not just the church around the corner, but people have options of where they're going. They can go on their phone and watch any church in the country in a matter of moments by pressing a button. So we're trying to make sure we have adequate digital spacing and quality digital content for
Hmm.
those who are seeking to connect with us. We have people who watch us in Georgia, in Texas, in Florida, in Kentucky, in just different parts of the country that are active participants in virtual space. So
Hmm.
that's been a key piece for us as well. And one thing we're working on now is really trying to revitalize our children and youth ministry, because the reality is, young families aren't going to stay at your church long if you don't have anything for their children.
Yeah.
That's one of the hard parts about retaining young families. So we're really working to see, what does that look like, whether it's a staffing model, a volunteer model, just having quality discipleship content for, our children, our youth, our young adults. Because the reality is, we're an older congregation. We understand that a church with no young adults, no youth, is a declining church. And we don't want to look up in 10, 15, 20 years and we're no longer in existence because we failed to disciple those who are coming behind us. So we're really trying to
Yeah.
do an intentional job of making sure that we have programming and content and resources made available for that next generation. Because the reality is this: they're not the church of tomorrow, they're the church of today. And a failure to disciple them properly is really committing, ecclesiological malpractice. And we can't afford to do that.
Yeah. So, many of our churches would say, yeah, we agree with all that. I think two questions that I would maybe ask on their behalf is number one, how do you um, engage the person online? In other words, there's this fear that goes, well, if we just make service available online, we're just creating a consumer culture, and they're just going to watch online. We're never going to see them in the building. We're never going to really be able to do ministry with them together. So there's that question. And then the second one is a number of churches are going, well, gosh, it would be great to have kids, and so we need to focus on that. I would imagine that there has to be changes in the methodology for discipling children and youth today. So, what encouragement would you give to churches who are wanting to reach young people, wanting to reach children, but just pulling out the Sunday school material that you used 25 years ago ain't going to fix it? So how do we get the engagement from the online person? And then what are some shifts that you're seeing from a methodological standpoint for ministering to children and youth?
Sure. So from the online perspective, I think for me, my doctoral work helped me a lot.
Okay.
I think there was a time where I was saying, I was in the camp where, online, they don't count. You got to be in person. You got to come, blasey, blasey. But I think nowadays, the fact that we survived online for 2 years and people kept joining, they kept getting baptized, they were being discipled, made me realize that there may be some merit to an online model because we were forced to do it. So
Yeah.
you can't argue, forsake not the gathering together, because for 2 years we couldn't. So you can't say that we weren't faithful for 2 years because we weren't in person. And the reality is, if we're going by the Acts 2 model, there were no large gatherings. It was house churches. They were going house to house, breaking
Mhm.
bread. That was the early church model. So I think there's merit in understanding that, honestly, for me, it requires reimagination. The seven last words of a dying church are this: we've never done it that way before. And I think the reality now of this post-pandemic model is we're having to reimagine what is a church member, what constitutes membership. If I'm
Mhm.
watching online, if I'm giving, if I'm in a small group, if I'm in Bible study, what do you get in person that I can't have online? And really doing the tough work of asking questions and formulating relationships in the virtual space. Because the thing is, we have it everywhere else. Like the church is usually the last place to evolve in terms of major technological shifts. I think
Mhm.
the reality is, when we meet people where they are versus trying to get them to come where we are, I think
Mhm.
we have
Mhm.
a much better rate of success, and particularly in this online field. When we offer, online new members orientation, we're about to offer online Bible study, just different realities to touch people where they are, because we understand our reach is not limited to Iroquois and Mac. We're trying to make sure we have resources available, so wherever you find us, you can still connect with us, and we have resources that are available to you in that space. It takes time. There is no bulletproof model. It takes, effort, creativity,
Yeah.
reimagination, innovation. And we don't have all the answers. The world is still changing. We're seeing the rise of this AI model, and just all that's it's always something. So I think it requires thinking outside of the box intentionally, and just knowing that, your way is not the only way. At the end of the
Yeah.
day, You can get 10, 5 plus 5, 4 plus 6, 7 plus 3, 8 plus 2, 9 plus 1. There are multiple ways to get to the goal you want to reach. So I think that's helpful to know. As for
Yeah.
children and youth, it requires presence, creativity. The model that we grew up on, just dragging your kids to church just because it's Sunday. People have options. Kids have options. So we're really having to, I keep saying, reimagine. We're having to reimagine what does this look like and really giving them what they want. I know it sounds like a consumeristic model, but the reality is I think we're having to literally ask our children and youth, what would make this applicable for you? What would make this relevant for you? How would this be enjoyable for you? And not being afraid to ask questions versus just doing what we want to do and saying, all right, look here, this is what you're going to have, this is what you're going to do. Because that's not how it's going to work. And the reality is we cannot afford to lose this generation of children and youth, because if we lose this children and youth, this generation of children and youth, then we lose overall. We can't afford to do that. The stakes are way
Yeah.
too high and they're way too important to be lost. And we can't have that.
I wonder if, there, as we talked, there's that tension of, is this consumer based ministry? Yet at the same time, I do think there's an invitation from the Lord in this season where we are in, because the church is no longer the dominant force, the dominant culture, and so now we're not leading with power and might. We're having to lead with humility, and that's a hard shift for some people. So this incarnational humility of, where are you and what does it look like for us to come alongside where you are, instead of expecting you to come to where I am, I think is a great and important piece for our churches. So so not only are you trying to reach the younger generation, at least for a little while longer, many of the saints in the pews would say you are in that group as well. So, based on just your own experience personally, and then professionally serving as a pastor, what encouragement, what advice, counsel would you give our churches who say we want to reach millennials, Gen Zs, or whatever, but we don't understand them and we don't have the foggiest idea how to reach them? And could you also address this concern they have? I'm 65, 70 years old. There's no way they'll want to connect with me at all. There's nothing that I can do, and they kind of wring their hands and feel defeated.
Sure. So I'm glad that you mentioned millennials and Gen Z, because I've grown weary of millennial conversation. Millennials have kids that are in church now. So the reality
Yeah,
is, if you're still on millennials, you're missing a whole group after them in Gen Z. So that's the reality. First of all, I think being honest is helpful. Admit, look, we need help. Help us help you. I think for so long, the church has led with in a with a superiority complex, an authoritative complex, like we're the final authority. Listen to us because we're the church. And
hmm
now we're having to lead with by saying, look, we need help. Help us reach you. Help. What do you need? What would draw you? What would keep you? What would connect you? And not being afraid to ask those questions. I think the reality is people have options. So, what you're offering has to make sense. It has to be applicable, relevant to people's daily lives. It's no longer enough for the sermon to not have any portability. People want to know, what does what you're saying on Sunday help me get through Monday to Saturday?
yeah,
What does this Jesus have to say about relevant issues? What does this Jesus have to say about justice? What does this Jesus have to say about inequality? What does your Jesus have to say about political upheaval? What does your Jesus have to say about things that are affecting my daily life? Like
yeah.
what is the relevance outside of the Sunday morning experience? And not being afraid to have tough conversations, because the reality is we're having everywhere else. Why can't we have it in the church? That's a
Yeah.
very real thing, and understanding that part of the draw is not being afraid to say, I don't know. We don't know. Can you help us? And
hmm
make a partnership versus just a monolithic or monotonous, dialogue from the church to the parishioner, but making it um a collective gathering that leads to mutual partnership, mutual understanding. I think that would go a long way.
So you got, we've got churches that they say, um, we look around and there's a sea of silver. There's just the congregation is older. We don't have anyone who even fits in this category of millennials, Gen Zs, or anything else. What would you say would be um, what advice would you give to them to say, here's a first step you could take towards being able to engage with Gen Zs and millennials who are not in your building, and you may not even know anyone that fits that category other than your kids or grandkids?
So the first thing I would say is find some who either you're adjacent to or directly connected to, and just have a conversation and do more listening than you do talking. I think
Mm,
the reality is when you can build a rapport for listening, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I
yeah.
think the reality is when you can leave a space and not be the authority figure and just say, look, this is what we're trying to reach, this is what we're trying to do. Will you help us? And
Mm,
understand it's going to take time. They're going to tell you what you don't do well. They're going to tell you where you're missing the mark, and your ego can't be so fragile that you miss the learning moments in what's being offered. Because most times they're going to lead with love. They're going to say, "Hey, lovingly, that's not what we need," or "Lovingly, this is not what, like you're missing it in a major way."
hmm hmm
Understand that like if you they're a group that you need to have, so you need to be able to have the conversation and the spaces to make sure that you're able to do that in safe space. And the ability is when you can build that kind of connection, you know, that group will beget other people who are in that group. So when even if
Yeah.
you start small, you can still find spaces to build along the way. It's going to take time. It requires patience. Oftentimes, actually, you never harvest when you sow, ever.
Right.
Like sowing time is a different season than harvest time, but just keep sowing, keep
Yeah.
on.
Yeah. One of the things that I think you're kind of getting at too is, and my experience has been when I connect specifically with Gen Z, I am amazed at their level of vulnerability and transparency. When I was a kid, if I bumped into an adult and they said, "Hey, tell me a little bit about yourself," I would be pretty surfacey because I wouldn't know what to say and I might feel uncomfortable. I'm amazed at the way in which I mean, they just empty themselves of here's who I am, here's who my struggles are, and their ability to articulate that well. And so, what I think I'm hearing you say is creating a presence to be able to engage with them. And then the other piece too that I felt challenged on is I think about the millennials, the Gen Zs in particular, is I feel like part of my role is to identify what are my strengths and what are my networks, and how do I leverage those on behalf of the Gen Z group, and make my strengths, make my networks available because they are very cause driven. And if I can come alongside them in that way, I found it to be helpful. I'm curious what your experience has been with that.
Yeah, I agree. I think transparency is definitely something that my generation leads with oftentimes because again they're going back to how does the church help me with everyday life? Like the worship experience is great, but I need something that's deeper than that. Like how
Yeah,
does how
yeah,
does what you offer me, affect more than just the 90-minute service on Sunday morning? There has to be portability,
hmm
connection, presence, coming
hmm
alongside people. I've had meetings, since I've been here with people who are, dealing with foster care, people who are dealing with just difficulties. And the reality is like, you never know people's story until you get to know them and just the
yeah,
realities of, ministry that reaches, people in their totality. And you can't just the days of just being surface and canned and shallow are long gone. People need depth. They need connection, and they need partnership in everyday situations. And if you can't offer that, you're gonna have a hard time keeping up.
yeah, yeah. And also gone are the days where the pastor is the resident expert. Knowledge has been so distributed, And so it used to be people would come to church and the pastor would tell them what they don't know. But now, Google, Chat GPT, I mean, you name it. So we are no longer the dispensers of knowledge, but
Oh,
maybe the thing that we can dispense that the world doesn't have to offer is a combination of agape love and wisdom. Because I don't see anywhere where Google or Chat GPT or any other AI outfit can offer you wisdom that cannot be computated.
I don't know. I think you nailed it. The church is no longer the resident expert. There was a time where if the preacher said it, that was as good as gold. That was all you needed. The pastor said it, that settled it. Nowadays, people are fact checking you as you preach. I've been
Yeah,
places people have asked me questions at some church in the past. You said this, but I was looking up this, this, and this, and can you explain that? And I had to understand that's a badge of honor because that means you're paying attention.
yeah,
You are not critiquing me directly. You're asking questions and dialoguing yourself with the sermonic moment. The reality is we have to make sure that we have our I's dotted and our T's crossed because people have the wealth of knowledge from the world at their fingertips with these smartphones. There is
yeah.
nothing people cannot access, and they don't wait till you're done to do it. They're doing that while you preach. Every
Hmm.
they're preaching along with you. They're fact checking. They want to make sure that you got
Yeah,
who is who and what is what in all those realities because that's just the culture we live in. So rather than trying to fight it, leverage it for your benefit and let it be done in a way that makes things positive.
yeah, yeah. Um, Question for you. So you've got a few years in ministry under your belt, but you got several more to go, Lord willing. What is something that you don't know that you hope in the next 5 years that you will end up being able to say, okay, now I know, so what do you know that you don't know? And what are you hoping that in the next few years you'll be able to get some answers and clarity to?
Wow. That's a great question. What do I know that I don't know that I want clarity on? I think for me, it's gonna be continuing just how to find a rhythm. I've been preaching 10 years. This is my first year of pastoring. So
Hmm.
Sundays come incredibly quickly. Um, that's a major thing. You look up, it's
Yeah,
Friday. I'm like, wait, it was just Sunday. Now it's almost Sunday
yeah,
again.
yeah.
I think in addition to that, it's going to be just managing all that there is to carry
Hmm.
high level. So Bible studies, funerals, family life, preaching, traveling, just seeing those who have done this 30, 40, 50 years who admit that, there really is no perfect model, but the more you do it, you continue to find that rhythm. So I think
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to continuing to build my rhythm and my regimen,
Hmm.
just because I know that that takes time and to give myself grace because I'm not going to solve it in year one. I think there was a time, even this year alone, like I would get down on myself because I felt like I wasn't doing a good job at it. And I was like, you just started, like,
Yeah.
relax, give yourself some time. So I think I'm definitely looking forward to kind of figure out how to continue to build that regiment of, making sure my rhythm is and my pace is where it needs to be to make sure I can stay healthy. Because, I do this, I'm at a pretty rapid rate these days. I really am. But I love what I do, but I want to make sure I can do it at a high level for as long as possible. So that requires taking care of myself and make sure that's, done at a high level.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, just a word of encouragement to our ABC Michigan family. Hopefully, this interview has been a blessing to you as it's been to me, and just an invitation to you that we have our annual gathering coming up shortly. And Dr. Gaines and his staff and deacons will be serving Holy Communion to our family, and there's something powerful about the multitude and the diversity of us coming together around the table. So I invite you to come and be a part of that. Introduce yourself to Dr. Gaines and just let them know that you were watching this and you were a part of that. And Dr. Gaines, I would wrap up with just this last piece. When somebody watches this, and the cool thing is about digital is they may watch it, in a month or two, or in 2 or 3 years from now. What is a prayer request that you would have that you would say, you know what, this is not going to expire. This one's not going to, there's not a shelf life on this prayer request. What is a prayer request that you would ask of our family of churches, so that 10 years from now, if somebody's watching this, they could be praying that same thing for you and know that it's right where you need.
Sure. So this is my daily prayer ministry. God, give me enough success, enough struggle to keep me humble,
Okay.
enough success to keep me going forward.
Mm,
I think that's a prayer that will never expire in my life. So if you're
yes.
watching and you have the desire, if the Lord put you on my heart, and you ever want to pray for Dr. Micah Gaines, pray that God will give him enough struggle to keep him humble, but enough victory and success to keep him going forward. I'd appreciate it.
Amen. Amen. Well, that would work across the board. So, well, Dr. Gaines, thank you for this time, and we are blessed by it. And I hope ABC Michigan family that you are blessed by it as well.